one last question, and that is, was Malthus right?
Well, look, Malthus did a lot of things and wrote a lot of things.
America's working class has been cheated. That is an assertion.
Open borders. That's the Koch brothers' proposal.
And the Democrats jumped right on board with the corporatists. They got in bed with Wall Street, military-industrial complex, the fossil fuels, Silicon Valley. And now look what happened to the country. We have the biggest income disparity since the Gilded Age. Bigger than that. There's more.
Expanded trade has thrown the working class into much more competition than they experienced before trade with lower wage countries took off.
Can say is that as a country, we have to make a different set of choices because the choices we've made have hurt working people.
Congressman, because I wouldn't know what to tell you to write. I don't know what to do about the depression and the inflation and the Russians and the crime in the street. All I know is that first, you've got to get mad. You've got to say, I'm a human being. God damn it. My life has value.
Hello, and welcome to another Institute for Sound Public Policy podcast. I am your host, Kevin Lynn, and today I am joined by William Rees. And William Rees is a member of the Royal Society of Canada, which is Canada's National Academy of Sciences, and is Professor Emeritus at the University of British Columbia and former director of the School of Community and Regional Planning. Bill retired from academia in 2012, but continues to conduct research and write, and has been very busy on the lecture circuit of late. His primary interest is in public policy and planning as it relates to global environmental trends and ecological conditions for sustainable socioeconomic development. He is the originator of the ecological footprint concept and a co-developer of the method. Much of Bill's work has been in the area of ecological economics and human ecology, including behavioral and cultural barriers to sustainability. And it's great he's still hard at work on these issues. As those of us who believe we cannot have infinite growth on a planet with finite resources are under mounting levels of attack from a strange assortment of special interests who consider limits to growth and population policy quaint notions of a bygone era and actively engage in vilifying those that are concerned with ecological overshoot, and to quote you, Bill, as being neo-Malthusian, anti-human, eco-fascist, or racist, just to name a few of the epithets they hurl our way. Bill Rees, welcome to the show.
Very glad to be here, Kevin.
Well, it's fantastic to have you here, Bill. And I was wondering how to start the show off, because I know the question I'd like to end with. And that question will be in about 45 minutes, I guess. Was Malthus right? But what I'd like to start off with, Bill, I was reading your one paper, it asked the question, what's blocking sustainability? And I got thinking of that Boogles song. It was one of the first music videos ever made. And it was titled Video Killed the Radio Star. and along that theme, Bill, did climate change kill the ecological movement in your mind?
That's an excellent question. I think in some ways it did, because human beings, I've recently written a paper on what I call cognitive obsolescence.
Right. Brilliant paper.
Humans evolved, we evolved in much simpler times. The human nervous system, our brains, evolved in circumstances where we, in the whole course of our lifetimes, meet maybe 100 other people. We stayed within a limited home range. We knew our habitats extremely well. And of course, there were risks and hazards and all of that. But quite frankly, compared to modern times, the environment didn't throw anything that challenging on us. So the brain evolved to think in relatively straightforward, I would even say simplistic terms. We tend to see things in simple cause-effect relationships, and we focus on one issue at a time. So if you think of climate change, the whole world today is preoccupied with climate change as if it were the real issue confronting humanity, almost the only issue. Of course, from time to time, we're sidetracked by other things, such as the epidemic, the COVID-19 plague, if you will, the war in Ukraine and now in the Mideast. But basically, climate change is our eco-focus. And I guess I would argue that this very simplistic, very simple, very singular focus is a distraction from the real problem, which is something called human ecological overshoot. Overshoot means that human beings, the human enterprise, all of our numbers, 8 billion of us now, and the economy, are using even renewable and self-producing resources faster than they can regenerate. And we are dumping wastes vastly in excess of the natural assimilative capacity of the ecosphere. Climate change is simply one symptom of this unbalanced relationship. It's really a waste management problem because anthropogenic climate change is caused by carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere, and carbon dioxide is the single largest waste product by weight of industrial economies. Anyway, the bottom line is this, that we're all focused on climate change and trying to solve it when it's only symptomatic of a much larger problem. And our efforts to solve climate change are not only making the climate worse, but they're extending overshoot so that the fundamental cause of climate change is, in fact, exacerbated and worsening as we proceed.
Interesting. And is overshoot then, so was I accurate when I said we can't have infinite growth on a planet with finite resources? Because in one of your papers, you showed the growth of population, you showed the correlation between the wealth of nations and the consumption of things like fossil fuels. I mean, am I being too simplistic?
No, not at all. It's absolutely the case. If you want to put overshoot, all that stuff I just talked about in simple terms, it's the result of too many people consuming and polluting too much on a finite planet. There are only so many physical resources. There are only so many hectares of ecologically productive landscape. We call it biocapacity. And as the human population increases, we simply displace most other macro life forms, large animals and so on, from their habitats. We take over those habitats, the landscape. We take over the energy flows through ecosystems and redivert them to reproducing the human enterprise. So basically, the human enterprise, again, that's just the economy and all of our vast numbers of people, are engaged in a process of converting the rest of nature into human bodies and the artifacts of our culture. And the result is that humans and their domestic animals, their livestock, now comprise about 97% of the mammalian biomass on Earth. Wild nature is left with 3 or 4%. So we're simply displacing other life off the planet. And at some point, there will be, and in fact, we're experiencing it now, a breakdown in life support services. Climate change, in fact, is an example of one such breakdown as we come to stress the systems beyond their capacity to accommodate an ever-growing human enterprise.
And Bill, what would be other examples of breakdown? Are we kind of seeing that in the quality of the food we eat in our diets today, which require an awful lot of oil inputs, to produce and generate food for these large populations, from the fertilizers to the transportation, everything else?
Absolutely. People are really ignorant, I think. Energy ignorant is a good way to put it, of the degree to which we are dependent on energy for just about everything that we do. The reason we're ignorant of it is because we've had, for the past just 200 years, an incredibly unique, abundant, cheap source of energy in the form of fossil fuels. But it's enabled us to really found an entire culture on the belief that this energy source, or at least some energy source, is always going to be available to sustain things. Most of our food production is utterly fossil fuel dependent. We couldn't grow nearly the kind of quantities of food that we do now without the industrial inputs, fertilizers, pesticides made from fossil fuel derivatives. All farm equipment is essentially run on fossil fuel and is unlikely to be electrified anytime soon. The processing and transportation of food is all based largely on fossil fuels. Every city in the world is a product of fossil fuels. The cities are parasites on the landscape that sustains them. But in order to bring the food and other resources into those cities, we need mass transportation, most of which is provided by fossil fuels in the form of diesel trucks, bunker-fueled cargo ships, and aircraft, none of which are likely to be replaced by electrified versions in the foreseeable future. And so the whole of our civilization hangs, or rather I should say is suspended in a sense, on a fountain of petroleum and other fossil fuel resources. That fountain is becoming less and less powerful. The gusher is running down, so to speak. We're scrambling desperately to find substitutes in the form of wind power and solar panels and so on and so forth. But the idea that we can quantitatively replace fossil fuels with these alternatives in the short-term time frame that we're looking at is an impossible fantasy. It simply isn't going to happen. We could go into the details. But the fact is we're utterly energy dependent. Fossil fuel right now is 80% plus of the global primary energy. People think that wind and solar are an absolute miracle and are taking over. But in fact, in the latest full data we have for, 2022, wind and solar combined provided less than 3% of the final energy consumption of global society. They have a long way to go, and they're not going to be able to do it, I'm afraid, in the time frame.
And don't wind and solar also require an awful lot of
Absolutely.
fossil fuel inputs? And
well,
so,
they're entirely constructed using fossil fuels. From mine head to installation and maintenance, it's a fossil fuel enterprise. So even if we were successfully to replace with infrastructure and so on, the fossil fuel quantity of energy, in the process, we would have a massive increase in the use of fossil fuels. It's not going to happen anyway, but that would have, if we had the resources, that would be the case.
Right. And in several of your papers, Bill, you talk about, in fact, I'll read from Overshoot, Cognitive Obsolescence and the Population Conundrum. And you stated, decision makers thus operate from the implicit assumption that continuous economic growth enabled by greater efficiency and constantly improving technology, the motivational nerves of industrial capitalism and its handmaiden, neoliberal economics, is all we need to navigate the hazardous waters ahead. I really want to get into that, but before we do, we talk a lot on our space about neoliberalism, and I define that, Bill, as the unbridled movement of capital, goods, and people across international borders for one purpose, and that is to maximize profit. And isn't that kind of what you're getting at? Is you talk about derivatives. Ultimately, the economists don't care about the amount of resources in the ground, our ability to effectively get at those resources. They look at it in terms of dollars. Hey, Kev, a year ago, oil went down to negative $35 a barrel. There's plenty of oil. We're swimming in it. And the shale plays, the ability to keep those schemes going really resembled Ponzi schemes. With oil below 120 a barrel, they just didn't make a lot of economic sense, yet we were selling the country on it. Can you kind of get into where this intersection of economics and resources and the physical and ethereal all kind of combine or come together?
Yeah, that's a huge question. I used to teach 2 courses on just that question. We have to go back a bit to understanding, again, human beings as an animal. We are an animal species, and we have one peculiar quality that we're not aware of in other species, and that is that we socially construct the realities out of which we live. Any other species simply takes the environment, for example, as it comes. But humans are storytellers. We make up stories, and then we live out of those stories as if they are a good map for the reality within which our society is embedded. So if you think of religious philosophies, academic paradigms, political ideologies, all of these things are made up stories. They're products of the human mind. Communism, capitalism are constructs that don't exist in nature outside of the human context. So these are stories that we make up. We profoundly believe in them once they're made up, and then we live out of them as if they are real.
Is
So if
this
we look
what
at
you
the
refer to, Bill, as a sociocultural reinforcement in one of your papers?
Yes, exactly. So humans, as an evolved species, have a natural predisposition to expand into all available habitat and a natural predisposition to use up resources. In fact, if we didn't have those attitudes, we wouldn't have survived and risen to the position of dominance that we now hold in the world's ecosystems. But the bottom line is this, that we socially constructed a discipline called economics. Economics doesn't exist in nature. It's a human construct. And there are many different variations of it, of course. But the one that dominates in the world today starts from a couple of very interesting premises. The first is, and keep in mind these are social constructs and nothing to do with reality, but we tend to believe in something called human exceptionalism. That human beings are not like other species, and we are therefore not beholden to the rules and regulation, the laws of nature, if you will. So one of the foundation stones of modern neoliberal economics is that the economy, the realm of human material activity, as it were, is essentially independent of nature. It's a separate system. And oh yeah, we draw on the natural world for some resources and we use it as a dump for our wastes, but that doesn't really matter because the single greatest resource is human ingenuity. The human mind is of such power that it can find substitutes for any good or service provided by nature and devise ways of dealing with our waste, particularly using the levers of the marketplace. And so by the way, human ingenuity translates to ever increasing technological progress. So we live out of a social construct called neoliberal economics, which has taken over the world. It's made one market of the whole of the world's material resource flows. And this whole construct is based on the belief there's no serious relationship between humans and nature. The economy is a separate system, and therefore there are no limits to the growth of the human system. There are no physical constraints on the economy that are likely to, in the words of one famous economist, Lawrence Summers, there's no limits to growth that are likely to bind at any time in the foreseeable future. So once you believe those two things profoundly, then people like me who come at this from a completely different perspective of population ecology are simply impediments to progress. Anyone who would challenge the growth ethic or the capacity of human ingenuity to overcome all obstacles to growth are simply, as I say, impeding progress. And I think you're probably in that same bag.
Yeah, it's amazing because I have been called anti-human. I have been called a Malthusian. I haven't been called a neo-Malthusian. They just call me a Malthusian. Now, I actually welcome it, but because I do believe we need constraints. And, here in the U.S., I also am, even though I'm the son of an immigrant, I get called anti-immigrant because I believe the best way to is not... Because here in the U.S., we stabilized our population in the early 70s, and it's only through immigration that we've increased the size. And we seem to, and it wasn't through anything forced. We had educated women, we had become more urban. all of these things naturally led to a stabilization of the population. And people seem to think that was a good thing at the time. And now I believe it's like all these economists are now looking for who the new consumers are going to be of all the stuff we have to produce to keep the economy going and keep Wall Street propped up. And yeah, so this is why I'm really eager to talk to you, because I just eat alone a lot. And there's just not many people that seem to agree with me. And so,
yeah, you put your finger on the real thing. Many people today think the population problem is the declining populations in a handful of relatively rich countries. And for all the reasons you've described, we need new workers. We need people to pay into the pension plans. We need a lot of young folks to support the increasing predominance of older folks in the population profile of most of these countries. But if you look at a country like Japan, Japan has had a declining population for some years. It has a relatively high proportion of post-middle-aged people in the population, but it's also one of the most prosperous and well-governed and in every dimension countries on the planet. Most indicators of population health, for example, would put among OECD countries would put Japan right at the top and the United States pretty close to the bottom. So we've got to really reconsider this silly notion that declining population is necessarily a bad thing. It's certainly a much easier problem, if we can call it a problem, to cope with than the kind of problems we're going to confront should the world population actually increase to the 10.4 billion people that the UN suggests is likely by something like 2080. So let's be real. This is a finite planet. We're already in a state of overshoot. I think people don't get that overshoot means we're literally consuming the biophysical basis of our own existence. This can go on for a certain amount of time. It's like having money in the bank. You can live on your savings, but you can only live on your savings until your first NSF check bounces,
right.
At which point you're up the creek. And when we run out of some crucial resource, or when the climate really goes chaotic on us, we're up the creek. It's simply too late to back off and do something that is going to repair the state of circumstances. So some scientists are saying now that we're putting as much as a third of the human population in immediate danger of starvation and death by mid to late century as the result simply of much of the planet becoming uninhabitable because of the singular symptom of climate change. But you take it or leave it. That's the direction in which we are headed, and we'd better be cognizant of that fact. Overpopulation, too many people consuming and polluting too much is a vastly greater problem globally than is the decline of population in rich countries. In fact, from our eco-footprint work, we can show that one North American, a Canadian or an American, is the equivalent of at least 4 to 5 average people on the planet, and perhaps 10 to 15 people in poor countries. So the more rapidly populations in rich countries decline, the more ecological space is freed up, and it should not be filled by more people from poorer countries. So we've got a population problem at both ends of the income spectrum. In fact, losing people in rich countries one at a time is of greater gain than gaining people in the poor countries, or at least losing people in poor countries. But that does not free up poor countries to grow into the space left by declining populations elsewhere. We're in overshoot, and the best estimates are that we need about a 50% reduction in material throughput. That's to say the energy and material moving through the global economy if we're going to pull this off. And if you want to pull it off with grace and with a reasonably decent standard of living, I think we have to recognize that the population has to come down very substantially as well.
Because I don't think people understand the externalities and the costs we're already facing. I was at a wedding this weekend, and someone was talking about when they were a kid, there was all this open space that they could play in. And that doesn't exist because they're getting ready to start a family themselves. And they're living in that same area. And he's thinking, where are they going to play? You know, it's a simple thing, but it addresses quality of life. You know, now we have to consume more on vacations to go someplace nice and interesting, as opposed to that holler in the back where I used to trap when I was a kid, things like that. Now, but the thing is, how is it then when you look at people that are dedicated to the notion of fighting climate change, yet at the same time, when you talk about solutions, there's very little where they sacrifice, where they're pulling back. There seems to always be some consumer avenue to go down, like, oh, I'm going to buy a Prius, for instance, or I'm, and as you were mentioning earlier, it is what sense does it make to bring someone from a country where the ecological footprint is a fraction of ours and bring them here and get them consuming in the first world? How do you, what's the mentality of someone who seems to really want to preserve our natural environment, yet at the same time just feels that, every solution, there's a consumer element to more, and there's not a lot of restraint involved?
Well, again, I think we're speaking here about the limitations of human understanding or cognitive ability. Most people who focus on climate change argue, as you did a moment ago, that if we shift to electric vehicles and so on, if we electrify the economy, then all is well. And what I try to emphasize over and over again is that all we're talking about, first of all, it's not going to happen. It's a physical impossibility. But if it could, we lose. Because what we're talking about here is business as usual by alternative means. We're simply shifting the mode of energy production and consumption. But if we don't change our attitudes about how we use that energy to literally scour the bottom of our earthly barrel of its resources, then we'll continue to grow and destroy the biophysical basis of our own existence. So there's no point in shifting energy sources if it means trying to carrying on in a growthist mentality, which is really what's happening here. Almost no one I know of who in the environmental movement is willing to contemplate the major sacrifices that will have to be made. And I don't want to put it in terms of sacrifices, because we're really gaining a great deal if we think of prolonging the potential of civilization. But it does mean a major change in our consumer habits. We shouldn't be talking about electric vehicles. We should be talking about no private vehicles in cities, for example. And in fact, it's even simpler than that. If you look at a big SUV, and in fact, the market is moving toward ever bigger SUVs with 2,000-pound or 1-ton batteries. These things are just as carbon intensive for the first 17 or 20 years of their lives as a comparable normal carbon burning or gasoline burning engine. So we're not gaining, we're creating another story for us to believe in. So as I said, human beings are great storytellers. We create social constructions that we all agree on, and then we jump into them as if that fairy tale is reality. And in fact, it's simply another illusion that in this case is worsening the situation that we were trying to solve in the first place. If you take overshoot seriously, the only way to deal with overshoot is by confronting all of its symptoms simultaneously. And that means finding ways, and there are lots of them, of reducing material throughput and beginning to recognize that there are too many people on the planet. And we need to extend to women much greater personal freedom, economic freedom, much greater choice. My province in Canada, I think, is the first generation institution. What am I trying to say? The first government in North America to make birth control freely available to anybody simply by walking into a pharmacy and signing the necessary papers. So this should be a universally available source of family planning and self-control, really, for people all over the planet. It would make an enormous difference in terms of slowing the rate of population growth.
And then too, personally, I think it's up to that family to make that decision. How many
Absolutely.
kids can they raise to honorable adulthood? And if the answer is 12, I live in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and it's not unusual. In fact, I'll be having one of the holiday dinners with an Amish family, and they have 14 children. They're amazingly fecund, yet they're able to seem to raise them to honorable adulthood and find work for them, although it's getting very difficult to find farms for the young people right now. Even land, let's say if they're going to buy a farm where the land was put into a trust that it would remain agriculture for now until time immemorial, that's going $48,000 an acre. So it's out of reach of a lot of families. And that gets into this whole where we develop all this great farmland, all these open spaces, and it's just not there.
No, I think the time has come to recognize that families of 14 are not possible. I don't mean to condemn anyone who has a family of 14, but let's face it, if everybody decided to have 5, 10 children, to go back to the very high rates of fecundity of a few decades ago, it would be catastrophic for the viability.
It absolutely would be. Right.
Absolutely. And as you say, there simply aren't the resources there to sustain them. Land is a perfectly good example. That family is not going to divide that farm into 14 equal shares and hope that each of those youngsters is going to be able to earn a decent living as a farmer. If you think of the current crisis in the Middle East, the Arab-Israeli war, the Hamas-Israeli conflict, it's really too many people without enough land. If there had been a fair settlement decades ago in which the state of Israel was co-created with the state of Palestine to house people who call themselves Palestinians, who haven't been welcomed by other Arab states, perhaps we wouldn't be in this circumstance. But there's not a great deal of land available in a very overcrowded situation. The whole of Gaza is, 2.5 million people on an area the size of Detroit, which is ridiculous when you try to think of sustaining that population in any degree of comfort, in any degree of self-sufficiency. Israel's the same. It's a very small country that's already grossly overpopulated and depends on imports for survival. In fact, we've done work that shows that something like 80% of the world's population are now largely dependent on imported biocapacity to maintain just their current, often inadequate lifestyles. So at some point, you have to recognize that not every country, not every population, not every region can be a net importer. Somebody's got to be out there doing the exporting with the surpluses. And there's only a handful of countries with really significant surpluses left on the planet, and they're sustaining all the rest. Canada's one of them. The United States is one of them. But again, one of my PhD students a few years ago did a study to show that in Canada, on our highly productive Great Plains, we export through food exports something like 65% of the land base of the Canadian prairie provinces. That's something to take into consideration because not many nations can afford to do that.
Right, and think of the inputs and fertilizer and everything. Whereas land, there should be allowed to go fallow for 2-3 years, but you can't do that with these with this pressure to export because this commodity. We began to actually weaponize it here in the U.S. in the 70s when agriculture policy became part of the national strategic policy, and they talked about food being a weapon. It's crazy. On the food topic, I went to a Bioneers conference years ago, and Michael Pollan spoke, and he's the author of a book called The Omnivore's Dilemma. And he walked out with a thermos and a McDonald's Big Mac bag, or bag with a Big Mac in it. And he poured this black stuff into this from this thermos into a cup, and he said, "This is about how much oil goes into your standard Big Mac." And at the end of it, because we were talking about being local and sustainable. And he asked this question to himself. No one answered it, of course, but can we maintain 7 billion people with on a local economy? Probably not. It gets into that overshoot that you've talked about.
That's exactly what overshoot is. You mentioned the concept of a Ponzi scheme, and that's really what we have. We built up this enormous global techno-industrial culture, but it depends on and assumes that there will be a constant, steady, and ever-increasing flow of energy to sustain it. If you plot GDP of nations against the consumption of petroleum, it's a perfect relationship. It's a lockstep relationship. The countries with the highest GDP consume the most petroleum per capita. If you plot the increase in gross world product for the last 200 years against the growth of the use of fossil fuels, it's a lockstep relationship. So the economy is utterly energy dependent. And so far, it's let me even back up further. If you can think of the human species, currently about 8 billion people, we've been around in our anatomically modern form for perhaps 250,000 years. It took almost that entire period to reach 1 billion, around 1810, something like that. 250,000 years to get to 1 billion. Then we began to use fossil fuel in quantity. And fossil fuel is the means by which modern techno-industrial societies have been able to provide all the food and other resources needed to grow the human enterprise. So prior to the 18th or 19th century, we've always had the Malthusian potential for geometric growth, but it could never be realized because we didn't have adequate resources. It was fossil fuel that relieved us from the negative feedbacks that were suppressing our natural propensity to grow exponentially. So for just 200 years, we've been freed from resource scarcity, from disease because of the advance of public health standards and so on, and we've been able to realize our human potential for exponential growth. So 250,000 years to produce a billion, 200 years to give us another 7 billion, 1250th as much time, and you grew sevenfold more. That's an astonishingly event in human history. This past 2 centuries of growth is the single most abnormal period in human history. And yet we, in our social construct around growth, take it to be the norm. It's not the norm, it is abnormal. And just like any other species, human beings will respond to resource and spatial abundance by growing. But just like every other species, when the resources run out, when we can no longer use a source of energy to provide everything else we need, when we can no longer sustain our public health systems, there will be a population correction. So in nature, something called the boom-bust cycle is fairly common. Species will expand, they'll boom in times of environmental, fairly benign environments with lots of food and so on and so forth. But they eventually reach a point where they've depleted their resource base, they've polluted their habitats, they squabble because there aren't sufficient space and resources left for the remaining, and then they crash. And there's no reason at all to think that human beings aren't subject to the same basic boom-bust phenomena. So I've argued that the last, just one more sentence, the last 200 years have been what I regard as the single-phase boom-bust cycle. We'll do it once, and the boom will be followed by a bust, and we won't recover to the former levels of population because we will have used up all of the resources that made that initial boom possible. And by the way, we're not going to colonize other planets or the universe in your lifetime or mine.
Just think of what the energy throughputs would have to be to get us to Mars. I think probably a good test bed would be the South Pole. See how well you do down there for a year, and then start thinking about somewhere else.
Yeah, we tried it in the deserts, I guess, of Arizona with something called Biosphere 2. An artificial.
How did that work out? When I was a kid, that was all the rage.
Yeah, well, it didn't work out, Kevin. It just they could not control the ecosphere within that biosphere. The carbon dioxide levels were fluctuating, oxygen levels fell, people were irritated, they got on each other. Anyway, the experiment did not work. So if you cannot create on Earth, right, a colony that can self-sustain, and then what makes you think you can do that on a hostile planet like
Right.
the moon or Mars, where you've got everything going against you from the get-go? It's not going to happen.
It's a silly notion. Let's talk about the future then. In one of your papers, I believe it again going back to what's blocking sustainability.
Mm-hmm.
You asked the question, can we reframe the future? If we could reframe the future, how would we do it, Bill?
Well, look, there's probably a dozen different social constructs that would satisfy that question. But I think the first thing you have to do is to recognize that we do live out of our frames. We don't live out of the real world, but our frames are only as successful as they map to reality. So if it is true, just for the sake of argument, that you cannot have a component of a system expanding indefinitely if the system that contains it is not expanding, that doesn't seem to me to be such a great stretch of imagination. And then you cannot have any component growing indefinitely within the global system. Human beings, whether we like it or not, are a component of the natural world. In fact, it's fairly easy to demonstrate that humans are the largest and most ecologically significant consumer organism in every single ecosystem on Earth, at least the accessible ones. So while we have an intellectual fantasy that the economy is decoupled from or decoupling and from nature, dematerializing, the reality is that with every new addition of humans and every increase in incomes, we become more and more dependent on the biocapacity of Earth and become an ever greater appropriator of the natural functions of nature. So here we are, one species of thousands, in fact millions, it's something like 8 million known species, all dependent on a fixed quantity of solar radiation translated into biomass by photosynthesis by green plants. And yet humans are taking an ever greater share of that finite energy flow through the system. It's not a sustainable situation at all. So the first step we have to do is to recognize that we are part of nature, that we cannot become so grand that our share of the total flows of the energy and material resources in the biogeochemical cycles through. If that share becomes too great, the system collapses. We are now entering a state of collapse. So we have to back off and recognize that in order to survive, so long as we are a dependent subsystem of the ecosphere, we have to live compatibly with that ecosphere, which means we live in what is called a sustainable steady state. We have to decide what level of throughput of energy and material can the macro system, the ecosphere, sustain indefinitely. Right now, humans are using so much and dumping so much waste that we're destroying the capacity of the ecosphere to retain its integrity. That's what climate change is all about. That's what biodiversity loss is all about. That's why the oceans are acidifying. That's why we're seeing a massive erosion of soils and croplands around the world. We're overusing the existing system. So the first rule would be in my world is to recognize we are a part of nature, whether we like it or not. And it's much better to be a contributing part of the system than a taker. We have to become a compatible, integral component of the living biosphere and contribute to its regeneration, its constant regeneration. A growth mode, by contrast, contributes to the constant depletion of nature. So I mentioned soils, you mentioned fossil fuels. What we've done with fossil fuels is destroy the Earth's soils. Economists say, well, it doesn't matter because human ingenuity has invented fertilizer. So we apply fertilizer to the land, which further destroys the land base, pollutes the water, emits nitrogen oxides into the atmosphere, which become part of the climate problem, and so on and so forth. So in our fanatical, growth-oriented tendency and reliance on subsequent technologies, we simply dig the hole we are in deeper and deeper and deeper. So it's time to back off, allow nature to recover, and to develop for ourselves a way of harmonizing human activity and rates of exploitation and waste deposition with the capacities of nature. So that's the beginning step. It's completely opposite to the current approach, which says we aren't part of nature and we don't need nature or any component of the ecosphere because our human ingenuity can defeat any blockage that comes up. So it's a complete reversal. People years ago used to talk about the need for a paradigm shift. A paradigm is a set of beliefs, values, assumptions, and behaviors by which you conduct your daily affairs. So the world today is running from a paradigm of beliefs, values, assumptions, and behaviors based on capitalist growth ethics served by neoliberal economic thinking, which is at complete odds with the nature of biophysical reality. So a paradigm shift would mean abandoning the beliefs, values, and assumptions behind this destructive model and mode of existence. It means developing a set of beliefs, values, and assumptions that are actually compatible with the way the natural environment, the ecosphere, operates. And we can do that. It's just that we have to, first of all, admit that we have a problem, just like any drug addict has to admit they have a problem before rehabilitation is possible. But once we come to the point where we admit that we've screwed up, it is entirely possible to begin to recreate human beings in a form of civilization that is compatible, and not only with the functioning of the planet, but with other peoples. We're not that good at getting along with other peoples on this increasingly shrinking planet. And as a result, as the resource base declines and the human population increases and incomes increase, we're seeing the results of increasingly competitive relationships. Every human being is in competition with every other human being for the declining biophysical capacity of the planet. And that's a very dangerous situation if we're all expecting more and more and more people.
In one of your papers, you mentioned the notion of negative feedback. Mm-hmm. Is part of the problem we're able to protect ourselves from the negative feedback loop that could have been experienced when we're down to 4 billion people on the planet. But we just seem to be able to continue that and not get hit with the consequences.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, as I mentioned, for the first 250,000 years of human history, populations just fluctuated in the vicinity of local carrying capacities around the planet. And by fluctuating, I mean, sometimes when times were good, populations would grow a bit, then they get slammed back by disease. The plague wiped out a third of the population of Europe several times in the Middle Ages. So the negative feedbacks keep populations of all species in control. So again, you start with recognizing that virtually every species is capable of geometric or exponential growth, but they are held in check by the natural negative feedbacks of disease, resource scarcity, habitat scarcity. There's not enough habitat for every male bird that desires to have a place to raise a family. And so some simply have to be non-breeders in those circumstances. So resources are going to be scarce and are scarce until something comes along to relieve us from that negative feedback. So in the case of humans, the scientific revolution greatly improved public health. We began to understand the basis of disease. We got a great deal of control over the human death rate. So we reduced death from starvation because of the abundance of food provided by fossil fuel-powered agriculture. More and more people survived disease because of the modern miracles of medicine and so on. public health standards, sewage control increased. So we had a tremendous boost to our capacity to grow exponentially. But we paid very little attention to the other end, that is to say, death control. Rather birth control. So here we had a population that was controlling its death rate, but not paying much attention to its birth rate. And so we had 200 years of expansion. Well, now in rich countries, we're starting to smarten up. Populations are leveling out for a whole variety of reasons, and that's a whole other discussion. But we're still seeing in relatively poor countries, particularly Africa, relatively high birth rates, and the human population is increasing by about 80 million people a year. That's the equivalent of 2 Canadas every year being added to a population, which is already an ecological overshoot. So as I say, we are seeing an increasing degree of competition for a limited resource base, and it's beginning to show up all over the planet as the rates of migrations of people leaving areas devastated by climate or war, or out-and-out war, such as between the Israelis and Palestinians, not enough space, too many people. It's a desperate situation, and not enough people are really aware of the nature of the causes of that situation, so that we're not focusing on solving them. And by the way, the world is largely run by megalomaniacs and people who are certifiably, sociopaths, if not actual psychopaths, who don't seem to have any compassion for other people.
Well, I know certainly the corporate America, my experience in private industry led me to believe, every boss was somehow sociopathic, and the higher up the hierarchy they climbed, the more these qualities seem to be, from a social Darwinism context, seem to be what got them promoted. The more paranoia, the more I need my stuff, the more. So, that's certainly a facet, because Wall Street, I don't think we're ever going to get the support of Wall Street on something like this, because at the end of the day, we're talking about less and not more, right?
Absolutely.
Wow. Well, when we started, Bill, I think we've come a long way. I'm hoping the audience takes away that there are biological presets that you spoke about in one of your paper that we are subject to as being part of this natural world. There are narratives, or as you talked about in one of your papers, social cultural reinforcement going on these beliefs that keep us from making the changes we need to, either it's individually or collectively. We talked a little about this techno-exuberance, this belief that, we're just going to get some technology in here and that'll solve it. 10 billion people, not a problem. We got technology.
Well, some people think we could have 1 trillion people on Earth. There's no limit.
Someone made the claim that, this guy Iglesias made the claim that America needs to have 1 billion people.
Yeah, it's the same thing. We have a book in Canada and an organization now promoting 100 million Canadians by the end of the century. So, those are the roots of delusion that are destroying the ecological basis for the existence of those people. And,
wow. Well, Bill, I promised when we started one last question, and that is, was Malthus right?
Well, look, Malthus did a lot of things and wrote a lot of things. It wasn't just his population thing, but basically he was right. He understood that human populations were capable of what he called geometric growth. We would call it, most people would call it exponential growth today. But he believed that agriculture was confined to arithmetic growth. So whereas population could grow in a accelerating fashion, food production could only grow in a linear fashion. So it was clear that population would always outpace food production. And by the way, when I said earlier that the human population for 250,000 years fluctuated in the vicinity of carrying capacity in each of its local environments, that's exactly what was going on. The possibility was always there for the exponential growth of those local populations, but they were held in check by the very, in fact, non-growth for most of that time in food supplies. So what Malthus did not anticipate was the impact of technology on food production. So food production has also increased exponentially, and therefore made possible the exponential growth of human beings. One thesis is that you would not have, well, it's not a thesis, clearly without the food, you couldn't have had the people.
Right.
So some people argue that it's food production that has resulted in this massive increase in human numbers. And they're absolutely true on a kind of simple-minded way. But the point of the matter is that is fossil fuel at work. Most of the calories on your plate are not in the food. The calories that really went into the production of that food are the fossil calories that were burned off in the production of the food on your plate. And some say it's as much as 10 times as much fossil calories have been devoted to producing the food on your plate as are contained in the food on your plate. So it's a tremendous imbalance, and we're unlikely to be able to maintain food production at these levels without the constant input of fossil fuels. By the way, we're seeing people today, and again, thinking simplistically, saying we've got to abandon fossil fuels, drop fossil fuels, disinvest from fossil fuels. All very well. But if we were to do so, suppose we quit using half of fossil fuels in the next 5 years, the global economy would collapse. Billions of people would starve. There'd be chaos from one end of the planet to the other, if you can think of a round sphere as having ends. But we're so hung on fossil fuels that we can't abandon them in the short term, and we don't have substitutes.
Right.
So the best we can hope to do, and if we were intelligent, we would be rationing our fossil fuels to those essential uses for which there are no short-term substitutes. And I would include in that most of the food production system, most global transportation. And we should be
along those lines, Bill, we're talking diesel. We need to,
absolutely.
Like you said, we need to greatly reduce privately owned vehicle ownership. And I think there's personally, I have one. It's a 2004 Subaru. I rebuilt the engine a few years ago. I could get by without it. I could get to all my sources of food. I live walking distance from an Amtrak station, so I could train to DC and New York, places I need to go. But a lot of people can't. And what we should be doing, you'd think the policymakers would be saying, okay, we need to create more walkability, more public access to local, regional transportation.
Yeah, and some places are doing bits of that. But in the main, we're seeing urban sprawl continuing, out over the farmland. We have a saying around here, well, we can always import our food from somewhere else. The farmland is worth, $4,000 an acre or whatever it might be. But look, as a parking lot, it's worth $50,000 an acre. So it's always that highest and best use notion where we simply undervalue food production. Do you know there's William Nordhaus is a Nobel laureate economist, Nobel Prize for his economics of climate change. And he argued that climate could never cost us much more than 3 or 4% of GDP. So it wasn't a big issue because after 2 years of growth, you've recovered that. In fact, he went a bit further and argued that since agriculture is the domain of the economy most likely to be affected by climate change, and since farm gate agriculture only contributes about 3% to the economy, we could lose agriculture and it wouldn't matter that much because...
Spoken like a real economist.
That's it, exactly. So again, you have to understand the power of these mental models that we create. People live out of their mental models. We give, Nobel prizes, or at least the economic Nobel is not quite a Nobel Prize, but it's the equivalent in money terms and prestige and all of that. But the point I'm getting at here is we award foolishness because it makes us feel good. That's the kind of feel-good argument that people love to hear. It's the same argument that convinces people to buy a Tesla and get out there and just continue doing everything they're doing now, but they're doing it without an environmental footprint. Complete lie.
Right.
But at least
and they're doing it on an asphalt road
Yeah,
with
that's right.
rubber tires,
With
with
rubber,
a
by the way,
battery that's going to have to be replaced.
that's right. And those rubber tires are wearing out much faster than they used to, and contain poisons that are killing fish in the local rivers, and so on. So, and they're wrecking the roads because the cars are so much heavier than standard vehicles. So there's, you can an ecological maxim is you can never do only one thing. So when you switch to, electric vehicles, you're not just switching to electric vehicles. You're creating a great disturbance in the force, to use a term that a lot of people can understand.
Absolutely. And God, I wish we had a lot more time. I'm definitely going to have you back. I'm going to read a few more of your papers and definitely get you back. But one last question, actually. How, if someone comes up to me and says, when I talk about population, they say I'm a neo-Malthusian, do you have a retort to that?
Oh, good heavens. No, I don't think there is a retort to that. Look, one thing I've learned in my old age is that when people have a fixed premise, a fixed notion, you cannot dislodge them from it. I'm glad to be called neo-Malthusian, because every piece of ecological news suggests that Malthus' timing was off, but he was otherwise dead on.
Wonderful. Well, Bill, how can people find you on the World Wide Web? Or how can they learn more about you, get access to papers and videos?
Well, I suppose they could send me an email message at wrees@mail.ubc.ca. But if you just Google my name, there's dozens of YouTube videos out there that various people have made. I never do this myself. I don't have the time or the technological capacity, but lots of other people have put up things that I've done in the past. And so I get notes from all over the planet from people who've said they saw this or saw that, and they think I'm an absolute neo-Malthusian loony bin or whatever it might be. So yeah, there's lots of material out there, and I correspond 4 hours a day usually with people who are interested in the kinds of ideas that I play with. So I'm happy to send you copies of papers and so on.
Wonderful. Well, Bill, I'll certainly put all that information on the comments section, and really looking forward to the next time we can catch up again.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, Kevin. You
Have a
take
great
care
day.
now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.